Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Digitally, where we continue the conversation with operators, practitioners, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and visionaries across the landscape of data, technology, artificial intelligence. Today's topic is data and enterprise data models. And we all know the history and the framing for this topic. It doesn't require much of an introduction. Data is exploding as we speak. More and more prolific use cases around data are coming true, and particularly with generative AI. One of the comments I heard from our guest today when I met with her is that make sure you don't get the cart before the horse. And I think the point there was with generative AI, data becomes even more important for enterprises. And then, of course, the last part of this is the economics are shifting. What it takes to run and manage and operate these data platforms at scale is much more efficient, much more effective today than it was years ago. And as a result of all of that, data-driven businesses are changing the landscape of the industry. So we're going to pick up on that topic and we're going to unpeel that a little bit more, because behind that very pithy saying, there are a lot of challenges. You know, three things we're finding increasingly is very key as you think about data as a new asset for corporations. First, ownership. Who owns it? Where does it sit? Where does it belong? How does it get a seat on the table? Second is governance. How do you think through integrity of data? How do you think about the master data management? How do you think about ethics? How do you think about security? And third, increasingly, is best business use cases. It's easy to get dilutive results across many, many experimentations. And what's key and critical is realizing the best use cases and driving capital allocation very efficiently around that, which all of that, by the way, brings us down to the one single thing we want to double click on today: operating models. What is the best operating model for data? Now, to actually have that discussion with us in some level of depth, we're going to bring in Alexis Bonacci. Alexis, welcome and thank you for joining.
Oh, thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Alexis is from FIS. And for those of you that haven't come across FIS, by the way, everyone has come across FIS in your daily life, but they're one of the leading technology providers to banks, to capital market firms across the world, to merchants globally. I think they serve about 95% of the leading banks and about 1 million merchants globally. So you and I have touched them in many different ways in our day-to-day walks of life. And if you can think about a company that is all about data, FIS is one of them. So against that backdrop of FIS, Alexis sits right the heart of the discussion we're about to have. She is the lead, the enterprise leader, the head of all of the enterprise data and the information architecture at FIS. And so with that, Alexis, I'm going to turn to you. And I'm going to start with the concept of operating model. And I'm going to want to hear your thoughts on how you think about, for instance, ownership.
Oh, absolutely. I think from a perspective of ownership, that's always the hot potato, right? It's who is it? The tech partners? Is it the business partners? The business has their own jobs to do. What does ownership really mean from a perspective of that area? For me, ownership is really who knows the most about the data. It's really it boils down to that, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the same ownership roles in the same space across the organization for each, for those individual data sets.
So let me ask you just on that, because there's a term that's been used quite a bit around centralized ownership and federated ownership. And I want you to give us a practical example of how you're set up as an example and how you think about federated versus centralized ownership of data and what's right, what's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is no right and wrong. I think the wrong is that there is no ownership, right? Especially in a data-driven culture. The way we look at it from where I sit is, there are, especially at FIS, which is a very, very large company, there's varying degrees of maturity within the corporation itself. And so we actually have a combined approach from a federated and a centralized ownership model. And it's really about what the business is ready for and what the business can be successful with. And so we really flex and grow and mature with the business based on where they are. We really meet them where they are.
And Alexis, just to get a sense for your size and scale, how big are you guys, roughly?
So it keeps changing. So we're around 65,000 employees. And I think the history of FIS is really growth by M&A, very quick, rapid growth by M&A. And I think anyone who's worked in that space, in the data space, what that means, not only from a business perspective, but from a data perspective, is just a bunch of, pieces and parts coming together and different ownership models. And again, different levels of maturity as those pieces and parts come to the business.
I love that. So I think really what we're hearing from a very large corporation, high growth business environment, focused on data as a central asset is, and I love the way you said it, there is no right and wrong in this. You have to be super agile. You have to be very flexible. You have to think about businesses at different levels of maturity within your organization. And when it makes sense, it's federated. When it makes sense, it's centralized. And I suspect, by the way, when you say federated, even with federated, there's some guardrails and there's some centralized oversight. I'm assuming that's the case, right, Alexis?
Yes, and we actually, we've implemented an incubation model within our data governance information architecture organization, where from a federated approach, we will bring in resources for 6 to 12 months, train them on our tools, train them on our guardrails and guidelines, our playbooks. And then once we're ready and they have the processes in place for that particular area of the business, we'll federate them back out into the business and they'll report up through the business, taking on those priorities, but really staying connected back to that centralized oversight through working groups, through town halls and meetings and lunch and learns, staying really connected, but also driving their area of the business and those business priorities that's meaningful for them.
Okay, so federated is not about, hey, you guys just go off and do your own things. You're still setting up a centralized framework, a governance methodology, a training and kind of toolkit standardization, if you will, some best practices sharing with this kind of special interest groups that you're talking about. And so there's still a role to play, but what you're doing is you're taking advantage of where the business is at relative to their need for it and what levels of maturity they're at in the different operating models. And that's good. So Alexis, that actually brings us to the second key thing, which is use cases, right? I mean, too often I see so many projects diluted across many, many different efforts and, one of almost everything. And then I think the big learning we've all had is to actually focus and zoom in on the best use cases. What would you add to sort of that? How do you help us think? I mean, how do you think about it at FIS and what insights can we take away from you on that?
Absolutely. I think you'll keep hearing me say this over and over again, and I'm a broken record and a proud broken record. Business, 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 right? It comes down to, the federated approach for us and that incubation model is really so that we can, from an operating standpoint, that centralized approach is so that we can align to the business goals and the strategic, direction of the business. And we're working on value-driven pieces of work. From that perspective and a use case perspective, again, if you're tied to the business strategy, you're working very closely with the business, you understand the roadmap, and you're working on value-driven use cases, that's really where the focus is. It shouldn't be, when we talk about an operating model from a top-down, bottoms-up, right? Top-down, that strategic business component, bottoms-up, that technical execution component. We must work in concert in order to do those things with that feedback and communication loop. And, having that centralized approach or that kind of center of excellence, if you will, really helps to facilitate that and make sure we're working on the right things.
I love what you said, because I think what you also said in many ways is technology is not really the long pole in the tent anymore. It's actually about how do you bring business into the loop? How do you pick up the right use cases? And how do you make it an iterative mechanism? And that intersection of business and data analytics or decision sciences or data and AI is key and critical. And it's obvious in the way you answered the question that that's key for you as well. So that's great to see. Okay, well, let me pick the third area that I know is top of mind for all of us, which is governance. And with that, of course, all of the issues of integrity and data management and security and sovereignty and everything that's involved around that. Talk to us a little bit about that. What are some practical learnings, frameworks we can walk away with?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I think it really is you wouldn't build your house on a swamp. You don't want to build your data infrastructure and your AI practice and your data practice on a swamp, right? Really getting that foundational layer from an infrastructure standpoint, really meaningful, which means the business requirements must influence those infrastructure and architectural decisions. And then from a governance and a data perspective, understanding what the use case is, again, what the business strategy is in AI, and really focusing on that business critical data from a governance perspective, from a data quality perspective, but also from a responsible use perspective. And so, I think that, again, when you had mentioned in the intro about, don't put the cart before the horse, we're really seeing this pickup in AI and the conversations of these really fancy, interesting, industry changing things that are coming, but you're only going to have as good of AI as you have a data and you have an infrastructure to support it. So for us, from a governance perspective, it's really just critical and foundational. And we have to really, be the voice that says, hey, this is what we need to do in order to make you successful in those areas. And so that partnership is critical.
I love your phrases, Alexis. I love the intended pun. I'm sure within "Don't build a house on a swamp." Yep. And you're referring to lakes and swamps and data houses and data lakes and other things. So it's fantastic that you said that. And you're right, with generative AI now adding to predictive and deterministic AI and all of the different flavors, we're now working with a lot of the hype and perhaps much of the discussion today across corporate boardrooms is on AI and how do we put it to use. And sometimes lost in that discussion is we don't have the right data to start with, AI is no good. And so building the right data platform is so key and critical, isn't it? And key to success around applying AI into the enterprises. So it's a point that's not lost. What an amazing set of inputs you've left us with, Alexis. When I first met you in San Diego, I had the sense that, you and I will do, you and I have follow-up conversations, and this is one of them. But, maybe as a last thing for the audience, you can leave us with, how does someone get to be someone like you? Like, what was your career trajectory to get you where you are, to the extent some of us want to be in a similar role?
Yeah, I think I have a non-traditional and non-linear path, quite frankly. I think it's just as by sheer grit and interest that, rolling up the sleeves and digging into data and learning and curiosity and just a lack of fear, I think. And I think the one thing that I will always leave everyone with is if you're doing what's best for the organization, you're doing the right thing. So I've always kind of had that as my credo going, and helping me along there.
And really underneath all of that, what I think we're picking up is that it's not about skills, it's about attitude and aptitude. And the fact that you bring the right perseverance, the right determination, the right focus is what it takes. And so with that, Alexis, it's been really fun speaking with you. I'm sure we're going to have more of these conversations. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for being part of this.
Thank you so much for having me.